In the winter of 1959, somewhere deep in the frozen wilderness of the Ural Mountains, 9 experienced hikers did something that made no sense.
They woke up in the middle of the night and cut their way out of their own tent.
Not through the entrance, not in an orderly escape, but by slashing through the thick fabric from the inside.
What followed was even more disturbing.
They ran, barefoot, underdressed, into temperatures that could kill a human in minutes. No signs of a fight, no evidence of an attack. And yet, they never went back. Weeks later, their bodies were found scattered across the snow, hundreds of meters apart, as if something had driven them in different directions. One had a fractured skull, another had crushed ribs, one was missing her tongue. There were no footprints except their own, no weapon, no clear cause. Only a question that has haunted investigators for decades. What could possibly force 9 trained explorers to abandon safety and walk willingly into death? Before the mystery became legend, it was just a journey, a planned expedition, a group of young people stepping into the mountains with confidence, not fear. They were students and graduates of the Ural Polytechnic Institute, engineers, athletes, individuals trained to think logically under pressure. These were not thrill-seekers chasing danger for excitement. They were disciplined, methodical, and prepared. At the center of the group was Igor Dyatlov, only 23 years old, but already known for his precision, his calm judgment, and his ability to lead in difficult conditions. He had organized previous expeditions, solved problems in extreme environments, and earned the trust of those around him. This journey was meant to be another achievement. The route they planned was not random. It was a Category 3 trek, the highest level of difficulty recognized at the time. It required endurance, technical skill, and above all, control. Every member of the group understood what they were walking into. They trained for it, packed for it, documented everything along the way. Photographs recovered later would show them smiling, joking, even playing in the snow. There was no sign of fear, no sense that anything unusual was waiting ahead. If anything, they looked exactly like people who believed they were in control. Their destination was the remote peak of Ortorton, a place so isolated that few had ever attempted the journey in winter. To the indigenous Mansi people, the name carried a warning: don't go there. But for Dyatlov and his team, it was not a warning. It was a challenge. The Soviet Union at the time valued endurance, resilience, and conquest over nature. Expeditions like this were more than personal goals. They were quiet reflections of a larger mindset. To endure the cold was to prove strength. To conquer the wilderness was to prove control. And for this group, everything about their preparation suggested they were capable of doing exactly that. There was no sign of panic, no indication of doubt. Just 9 individuals moving forward with purpose. Which is what makes what happened next so difficult to accept. Because nothing about them suggests they would make a mistake. And yet, something forced them to act as if they had lost control entirely. The expedition began on January 23, 1959. At first, everything followed the plan. The group traveled by train, then by truck, moving steadily deeper into the remote northern region of the Ural Mountains.
Civilization faded behind them with each passing mile, replaced by endless snowfields and silent forests. There was nothing unusual about the early days. They laughed. They documented their progress. They followed procedures they had practiced many times before. But expeditions like this are rarely defined by the beginning. They are defined by the decisions made when conditions start to change. And that moment came quietly. A few days into the journey, one member, eerily, began to feel unwell, joint pain, fatigue, symptoms that made continuing dangerous. The group faced a simple choice: push forward together, or send him back alone. They chose the logical option. Uden returned. The remaining 9 continued on. At the time, it meant nothing, just a minor adjustment in the plan. But in hindsight, it marked the last moment when the outcome could have been different. From that point on, the group moved deeper into isolation. The terrain became more difficult, the weather less predictable. Wind patterns shifted across the slopes. Snow accumulated unevenly, forming unstable layers beneath the surface. Still, they pressed forward. Their goal remained unchanged: reach Otorten, complete the route, and return as a successful expedition. Then on February 1st, something subtle but critical happened. As they approached a high ridge near Kholat-Syakhl, visibility began to deteriorate. Strong winds swept across the open slope. Snow reduced contrast between ground and sky, creating a disorienting white void, what experienced hikers call a whiteout. In those conditions, even small navigation errors can become significant. Instead of descending into the nearby forest, where a natural cover could provide protection from wind and cold, the group veered slightly off course and found themselves exposed on the mountainside. They could have corrected it. They could have retreated. But they didn't. Perhaps they believed it was temporary. Perhaps they underestimated the risk. Or perhaps they made a conscious decision to stay. They began setting up camp directly on the slope. This was not standard practice. Experienced hikers avoid exposed terrain at night, especially under worsening weather conditions. The forest below offered both shelter and firewood, critical resources in sub-zero temperatures. And yet, they chose the open ground. They cut into the snow to stabilize their tent, anchored it against the wind, prepared to endure the night. It was a decision that, on the surface, seemed manageable. But it changed everything. Because once night fell, they were no longer just navigating the mountains. They were fully exposed to it. And whatever happened next began here. On that slope, in that wind, with a decision that cannot be undone. Night came quickly in the Ural Mountains, not gradually, but all at once. One moment there was dim light reflecting off the snow. The next, only darkness, wind, and the sound of fabric straining under pressure. The group had already set up their tent on the exposed slope of Kholat-Syakhl. They had cut into the snow to create a flat surface, anchored the structure as best they could. From a technical perspective, everything appeared controlled. But the mountain was not. Wind speeds increased as the night deepened, sweeping across the slope without obstruction. Each gust carried fine snow particles that accumulated unevenly, forming layers that shifted under their own weight.
Inside the tent, the hikers would have felt it first as a vibration, a low, persistent tremor beneath them. Then, pressure. Snow pressing against the sides, the fabric tightening, the structure beginning to deform. At this point, experienced hikers don't panic. They assess. They wait. But something changed. Because what happened next was not a controlled evacuation. It was immediate, urgent, instinctive. The tent was cut open from the inside. Not carefully, not in a single line. Multiple slashes, quick, uneven, desperate. Whatever triggered that reaction, it overrode training, logic, and survival protocol. They didn't put on boots. They didn't gather supplies. They didn't even use the entrance they had built. They escaped. Into wind that could strip heat from the body within minutes. Into darkness so complete it erased distance and direction. Footprints, later found in the snow, told a quiet but disturbing story. They were not running blindly, at least not at first. The tracks moved in a relatively straight line, descending toward the forest below. Side by side in some places, separated in others. It suggested something even more unsettling than panic. It suggested controlled fear. As if they were leaving quickly, but not chaotically. As if they believed distance, not speed, was the key to survival. At the edge of the forest, 2 members, both named eerily, were found beneath a large cedar tree. They had tried to start a fire. The remains of it were still there, charred branches, ash buried under snow. Above them, the tree told another story. Branches were broken as high as 5 meters off the ground. Not snapped by wind, but by force. Someone had climbed. In freezing temperatures, with bare hands. Possibly to gain visibility, or to escape something on the ground. But whatever they saw, or thought they saw, they came back down. And they died there. Further upslope, 3 more bodies were discovered in a line between the tree and the tent. Their positions were precise, one after another, as if they had made a decision to return, to go back to the tent, to retrieve what they left behind. But the cold moved faster than they did. Hypothermia doesn't always look like collapse. Sometimes it looks like confusion, disorientation, a false sense of warmth. And in that state, decisions become unreliable. Movement slow, judgment fades. The mountain doesn't need to chase you. It just needs to wait. Months later, when the snow began to melt, the remaining 4 bodies were discovered in a ravine deeper within the forest. Unlike the others, they were better dressed. They had taken clothing from those who died before them, layered themselves, adapted. They had tried to survive, and for a moment, it seems like they might have. But their injuries told a different story. Severe internal trauma, ribs broken with immense force, a skull fracture consistent with high impact pressure, and yet almost no external wounds. No defensive marks, no signs of struggle. It was as if the damage had come from something powerful, but invisible. Not a blade, not a fall, not anything easily explained. One victim was missing her tongue,
Others had soft tissue damage that suggested prolonged exposure, or something more difficult to define. By the time the full scene was uncovered, the timeline had already collapsed into fragments. There was no single moment where everything went wrong. Only a series of decisions, reactions, movements, each one making sense in isolation, but together forming something that no longer felt rational. And the deeper investigators looked into those final hours, the less they seemed to understand them. By the time investigators arrived, the story was already broken. Not incomplete, but fragmented beyond repair. There was no single moment they could point to and say, "This is where it happened." Instead, there were only traces. A tent, still standing but no longer whole, fabric torn open from within, as if the barrier between safety and danger had been violently rejected. Inside, everything remained. Boots lined near the entrance, clothes neatly arranged, personal belongings untouched. It looked less like an escape and more like an abandonment. Outside, the mountain held the rest of the story, but only in silence. Footprints led away from the tent, pressed into the frozen slope, clear at first, then fading, then gone. No signs of pursuit, no second set of tracks. Just 9 individuals, walking away from the only shelter they had. Whatever they believed was inside that tent. It was worse than the cold, worse than the darkness, worse than death itself. Because in that moment, without hesitation, without preparation, they made the same decision: to leave everything behind and step into a night they were never meant to survive. When the group failed to return on schedule, concern did not come immediately. Delays were expected in expeditions like this. Weather could slow progress. Routes could change. For a time, silence was not unusual. But as days passed, that silence began to feel different. There were no messages, no signals, no confirmation that they were even still moving. By late February, the waiting turned into action. Search teams were organized, at first by fellow students and volunteers from the Ural Polytechnic Institute, people who knew the terrain and the people they were looking for. But as conditions worsened and no trace was found, the operation expanded. Rescue units were deployed. Military personnel joined the effort. Aircraft began scanning the vast frozen wilderness from above. Helicopters traced grid patterns over endless white. Planes circled, searching for any sign of movement, any disruption in the snow. But the mountains gave nothing back. It was as if the group had simply vanished. Then, on February 26th, nearly a month after the expedition had begun, something finally appeared. The tent, half buried in snow, still standing, but abandoned. At first glance, it didn't look like a disaster site. There were no signs of collapse, no evidence of fire, no indication of a violent struggle. But the details told a different story. The fabric had been cut open from the inside. Not a single clean exit, but multiple slashes made quickly without precision. Inside, everything remained. Clothing, boots, food supplies, personal belongings. Items essential for survival in sub-zero temperatures. Left behind. For experienced hikers, this was not just unusual. It was unthinkable. Searchers began following the tracks leading away from the tent. At first, they were clear, footprints pressed into the snow, preserved by the cold. But there was something unsettling about them. They were made by people without proper footwear, some barefoot, some in socks. And they moved away from safety. As the search continued, bodies began to appear. Not together, not in one place, but scattered across the slope into the forest toward the ravine. Each discovery answered one question and created several more. Why were they so far apart? Why had some tried to return? Why had others moved deeper into the wilderness? And perhaps most disturbing of all, why did none of it look like a coordinated survival effort? Despite the scale of the search, despite the manpower, the aircraft, the time invested, there was no clear sequence of events. No single explanation. Only fragments. By the time the final bodies were recovered months later, the conclusion should have been clear. But it wasn't. Because even with everything laid out in front of them, investigators were left with a case that made less sense the more they examined it. The official report would later describe the cause of death as a compelling natural force. But it never explained what that force was. And perhaps more importantly, why 9 experienced hikers failed to respond to it in any way that made sense. At first, the case seemed like a tragic accident. Harsh weather, human error, a series of bad decisions under extreme conditions. But the more investigators looked into the details, the less that explanation held together. Because the evidence didn't just leave gaps. It contradicted itself. Take the injuries. Several of the hikers had died from hypothermia, something expected in sub-zero temperatures. But others showed something far more unusual. Massive internal trauma, crushed ribs, a fractured skull. Injuries consistent with high-impact force, the kind seen in car accidents. And yet, there were no external wounds to match. No cuts, no bruising consistent with a violent collision. It was as if something had applied enormous pressure without leaving a visible trace. Then there was the clothing. Some of the victims were found wearing garments that didn't belong to them, layers taken from others who had already died. A sign of survival instinct, adaptation. But tests later revealed something unexpected. Traces of radiation. Not enough to be immediately lethal, but enough to raise questions that were never fully answered. Where did it come from? None of the hikers were known to be working with radioactive materials at the time. And the location itself was not officially associated with contamination. Then came the reports from outside the expedition. In the weeks surrounding the incident, multiple witnesses in nearby regions described seeing strange lights in the sky. Glowing spheres, orange in color, moving silently, hovering, then disappearing. At first, these accounts were dismissed. Misidentifications, natural atmospheric phenomena. But they appeared in multiple testimonies from different locations at roughly the same time. And then there were the photographs, recovered from the hikers' cameras. Most showed ordinary moments, preparation, travel, snapshots of the journey. But one image stood out. Blurry, grainy. A frame filled with streaks of light, as if something luminous had been captured in motion. It was never conclusively identified. And perhaps it couldn't be, because every piece of evidence seemed to point in a different direction. A natural disaster that left unnatural injuries. A survival attempt that ended in irrational decisions. External phenomena with no confirmed source. Individually, each detail could be explained away. But together, they refused to form a single, coherent narrative. Instead, they created something else entirely. A case where every answer led to a new contradiction. And every attempt to simplify the story only made it more complex. Over the years, countless theories have tried to explain what happened on that mountain. Some grounded in science, some built on speculation, and some that exist in the space between the two. The most widely accepted explanation is a natural one. A slab avalanche. Unlike the dramatic avalanches seen in films, this type can occur silently. A dense layer of snow shifts beneath the surface, destabilizing everything above it. In this scenario, the hikers may have felt the ground beneath them begin to give way. A low rumble, a sudden pressure. Enough to convince them that staying inside the tent was more dangerous than escaping into the cold. It explains the urgency, the cuts in the tent, the decision to move downhill. Even some of the injuries could be partially accounted for by the force of compacted snow. But the theory is not complete. It does not explain why the tent remained largely intact, or why the group did not attempt to return once the immediate danger had passed. It answers some questions, but leaves others untouched. Another theory suggests something far less natural. Military testing. At the time, the Soviet Union was actively developing experimental weapons. Some researchers believe the hikers may have unknowingly entered a test zone. Explosions in the distance, shock waves traveling across the mountain, powerful enough to cause internal injuries without leaving visible external damage. It could also explain the reported lights in the sky, and even the traces of radiation found on some of the clothing. But this theory comes with its own problems. There are no declassified documents that directly confirm such an event at that location and time. No official acknowledgement. Only fragments and possibilities. And then there are the theories that exist at the edge of explanation. Infrasound. A phenomenon where specific wind patterns create low-frequency vibrations, inaudible to the human ear, but capable of affecting the body and mind. Some researchers suggest that under certain conditions, it can induce intense anxiety, disorientation, even panic. In that state, rational thought breaks down. Decisions become instinctive, illogical. It could explain why experienced hikers suddenly abandoned their shelter without clear reason. But infrasound leaves no trace. No measurable evidence after the fact. It is by nature difficult to prove. And beyond that, there are theories that step completely outside conventional science. Unknown entities, unexplained forces, something encountered rather than triggered. These ideas are often dismissed, and yet they persist. Because for some, the behavior of the hikers, the fear, the urgency, the complete abandonment of survival protocol, feels less like a reaction to an event and more like a response to something they experienced directly. Something close. Something immediate. In the end, each theory builds its own version of reality. Each one fits part of the evidence, but none of them fit all of it. And that may be the most unsettling truth of all, because it means that no matter which explanation you choose, you are forced to ignore something. Today, the place where it happened is known as Dyatlov Pass, a quiet stretch of snow between two ridges, unremarkable at first glance. There are no ruins, no visible scars left behind, just wind and silence. Over the decades, investigations have been reopened. Modern researchers have applied new models, new data, new technology. Simulations have been run, theories refined, and yet, no explanation has managed to account for everything. Not the injuries, not the behavior, not the contradictions that refuse to disappear. For every answer that feels convincing, there is always one detail that doesn't fit. One piece of evidence that remains out of place. And that is what keeps the story alive. Because this is not just a mystery about how 9 people died. It is a mystery about why, even now, with all we know, all we've discovered, we are still unable to agree on what truly happened. Maybe the real question is not what was on that mountain that night, but what kind of truth can remain hidden for this long in a place where nothing else survives.